61 years ago, the People's Republic of China carried out an unprovoked attack on India's borders. Over 1,300 Indian soldiers died defending the borders. 61 years later, those questions of the Indo-China War continue to haunt us. And with me today is the Honorable Minister of State for Communications and Information Technology, Rajeev Chandrasekhar. Mr. Chandrasekhar, welcome to the News9 Plus show.
Thank you, Sandeep.
First question, what are the big what-ifs of the 1962 war that continue to haunt you? You're part of the generation born after the war.
No, I think it haunts pretty much every man who was in the armed forces at that time. It haunts the families of the 1,300 men who died. It haunts the families of many generations of those families who served and who were traumatized by this real, this debacle. And it was a debacle, and there was absolutely no way of putting it but that. But that it was really a combination of hubris, incompetence on the part of the political leadership, the lack of a commitment to a strong security framework, the lack of modernization of our armed forces from the independence of 1947 onwards. And really, at the end of the day, a classic case of a political failure having to be paid for with the lives and families and disruptions of men in uniform who had not been allowed to modernize since the World War II. And you were setting forth unacclimatized, untrained soldiers and commanders into a battle with a very determined enemy and who had played India for several years and decades before that. So in a lot of ways, that marks, in my opinion, in the otherwise illustrious military history of India and the Indian Armed Forces, and the otherwise, glorious history of India defending its own sovereignty and borders through the ages and centuries. It certainly marks a low point for us today, sitting back and looking at the history of India. But more importantly, it certainly marked a really low point in the men and women who so proudly and courageously signed up to serve and defend our motherland and the country in those cold, dark, bleak days of 1962.
Right. So it was a political failure that then turned into a military debacle.
Oh, 100%. I think there is no way, any way which you try and spin it. And there are many people who write thick, fat books about Krishna Menon and how great he was, and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and how great he was. And I certainly don't want to join in a conversation or indeed dispute that. And they may have been great in many ways. But certainly in this singular issue of dealing with China, a country that has since grown to haunt India for successive generations and is now haunting the world at large, that it is clear that the political leadership of that time, either through a combination of delusion or hubris or both, or a misguided sense of socialism and a belief in leftist ideologies, allowed that monster to grow. That monster certainly created harm for us in 62 and has certainly remained a not so friendly presence in our northern borders for several decades after that, including in the recent episodes in Galwan. And I think the fact that in 1962, a country that was just coming out of 15 years of independence was attempting to create its own identity as an independent nation, a proud nation, had to deal with this type of shame. And that shame was squarely put on the head of our country and our people by an inept political leadership. Of that, I have no doubt. And there may be many people, like I say, who try to rewrite and circumscribe history and try and sugarcoat it. But the reality is that we had no business being felled by China at that time, and we were.
Right. Have we, 60 years later, have we exorcised the ghosts of the 62 war?
No, I don't know if we've exercised the ghost, but certainly the India that we are living in today is a very different India. I think there are two aspects of the 62 war that we certainly believe in today's India will never happen. One is that the fact that you were humiliated, and we were in a sense gullibly and naively misled by this neighbor into being humiliated, conceding 38,000 square kilometers of our territory, and bullied around in that manner. I certainly don't think will happen ever again. The second is, I think the tentative nature with which we responded, where, for example, the Air Force was never deployed, where we had clear air supremacy, and the fear of escalating conflict, this fear that the political leadership had of taking on a bully, that will certainly not be repeated in 2023 under this framework and this new India. But we have traveled a long distance, certainly, as a people, as a military, as political leadership that our people have built. But that moment in history is certainly a moment that every generation, even if you are an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old today, and that seems a very long way back, should never forget. Because the Major Shaitan Singhs and Joginder Singhs, Subedar Joginder Singhs, really with their blood have, in a sense, built this future for us, where we can today afford to be more strong, more confident about dealing with the same country that did that to us in 62.
You have a personal connect with the war, and I just pulled out this photograph as if you
yes,
look at it. And
yes, absolutely. This is my father. Amongst the many stories of the 62 war, including of Major Shaitan Singh and Subedar Joginder Singh and so many people, there is certainly one more person that is of personal interest to me. There was a Flight Lieutenant M.K. Chandrasekhar, who was still not my father. It was 1962, and he was airlifting troops, and he has told me these stories many times about how he airlifted the Sikh regiment and how he airlifted the Gorkhas on many flights.
and he
to
flew
the
a Dakota.
He flew a Dakota on the DC-3.
Very similar to
Same
that, the one right there.
Same aeroplane that he kept flying. And incidentally, in 64, after the war was over and the hostilities had finished, he was decorated with the VSM for those operations. So yes, there is certainly a personal connect. And he has told me these stories about how they would fly back dead bodies and how they would fly back grievously injured soldiers. And he has, they don't talk about these things too much, but when they do talk about how they would see these young boys, young soldiers and young Jawans, obviously under-equipped, carrying Lee Enfield World War II type of weaponry, being sent off into battle, unacclimatized, rushed into battle from these ALGs, advanced landing grounds, and really in a lot of ways almost cannon fodder for the political ineptness and the delusion of the then defense minister and the military leadership, as you know. And so those are things that remain embedded in people's minds, like my father, and he has certainly shared those stories with me.
Yeah, so China was always the dragon in your
living
room.
Of course, and I spent a lot of my childhood in the Northeast where my father served, and certainly those stories of 62 remained with me for several years after that. And and I think one of the things that if you talk to service men and women in uniform, men in uniform from those days, there was almost a quiet stoic determination after that it will never happen again, and they will never let it happen again. And mercifully, the political leadership in 65, Lal Bahadur Shastri ji, and then of course 71, Indira Gandhi, gave a lot more respect to capable generals. That fear that the Pakistan type of coups would happen in India, and therefore this paranoia of V.K. Krishna Menon of underfunding the armed forces, always pushing generals like General Timaya, strong leaders down, which was really a characteristic for and a reason for the 62 debacle, was soon replaced by getting strong leadership in the army.
So that's another school of thought which actually says that we learned from the lessons of the 62 war, and if we hadn't kind of been taught that lesson, if that's the word,
Look,
we wouldn't have
Sandeep,
got the victory of
you are also a
71.
student of military history, and everywhere in conflict, even for a dictator like Stalin,
Yeah.
When he tried to cleanse his armed forces with all the generals and try to stuff them with his own favorite
Yes,
comrades,
yes.
he found that Hitler was wiping the floor with his army in general, and he had consecutive losses. When he brought back those great generals, Zhukov and all these real capable generals, military history tells you that finally wars can never be won.
That's right.
By so-called intellectual V.K. Krishnamenon type ministers. It is generals. It is like General Manekshaw or General Timaya. It is all of the generals that preceded 62 and post 62 that changed the course of, I think, India's military confidence and capabilities subsequently. It took a lot of repair, but the damage that was caused in 62 is something that we should never forget, because frankly, that caused a permanent loss of 38,000 square kilometers of land, and it created an aggressive sort of a bullying posture and confidence about that bullying posture in our northern neighbor that remains intact to this day. And in a sense, I mean, we can even go so far as to say that posture is something that has created modern China today, and they do that with the Philippines, they do that with Taiwan.
Big bully.
So I think in a lot of ways that is 62 was a setback, not just for India but for most of Asia.
Mr. Chandrasekhar, does it bother you that the Air Force was not used in 62? We had such a capable Air Force, fighters, bombers, the works.
Yeah, more than the fleet itself, the Indian Air Force consisted of men who had just come out of World War II and were amongst the most competent, capable, battle-hardened air warriors in this part of the world. There was nobody else in this part of the world with that kind of, battle-hardened capability in the air. And it remains one of those great mysteries on why Pandit Nehru did not deploy the Air Force. His ostensible reason, which is publicly available, that he feared that it would expand the conflict. Now, when an enemy is taking 38,000 square kilometers of land away from you, and you are fearing expanding the conflict, I certainly don't think the two things add up, because if you feel that 38,000 square kilometers of land being taken away by a country who's attacked you is no cause for you to fight back, then of course that may have been his thinking in 1962, but certainly not the norm today. I mean, we will fight hard for every square inch of land. But the more important thing there is, really one of the most important things also about this lack of air deployment and this conceding of the land is this narrative leading up to 62, which almost encouraged the country like China to take the land, because the narrative in 1959 in Parliament, the Prime Minister said, "Why are we fighting over this, a place where not even a blade of grass grows? Why should conflicts be fought for beautiful mountains?" And there was all this eloquent poetry when the discourse and focus should have been about national security, sovereignty, territorial integrity. So, it'll remain one of those mysteries on why Pandit Nehru was deluded into this. Was he misled by his defense minister Krishnamenon? Was he misled by the Chinese? But certainly there's no doubt in military doctrine, military doctrinal history, that not deploying the Air Force certainly cost us. And the cost was paid for by many, many men, Van Kumau and all of those people who died in Rezangla. Imagine if there was air cover. Imagine if there was, bombers that were deployed or fighters that were deployed for ground attack roles. So, what may have happened may have been very different if the Air Force would have been deployed.
And the outcome of the war would have been different.
I don't know if the outcome of the war may have been different. That is not our business to predict. But certainly, the army that was fighting such an one-sided battle, under-equipped, under-trained, under-acclimatized, would have certainly been given more succor and more support if there was air cover and there was air supremacy. And that air supremacy was impacting the Chinese troops who were sort of coming in waves. So certainly the Air Force's deployment would have altered the nature of this conflict, and it would have not been left to this really under-trained, under-equipped, under-prepared army to deal with this aggression on its own as it had to.
60 years later, we are back to a military standoff with China. The China that attacked us in 62 was not a nuclear armed state. It was not an economic power. Right. It was not a military power. And most importantly, it didn't have a collusive relationship with another nuclear power, that's Pakistan. Right. In that sense, today, are we facing a far bigger threat from China? And how capable are we of handling this?
No, I think more than anything else, I think without commenting too much about this country or about one country, I think in today's world, there is certainly, especially in the post-COVID world, there is a sense that there are more and more countries, or at least a few countries, that believe that the global rules or some world order that respects rules don't apply to them. And I think that is disturbing, and that is not necessarily good, especially when our Prime Minister says that this is a time, especially when we're going through all this distress post-COVID, that this is not a time for war, this is a time for development, this is a time for growth, this is a time for looking after our people, making sure all of those who are poor in the global south are given an opportunity and a leg up. This is certainly not a time for conflict, war, aggressive, territorial, predation. So in that context, certainly this is aberrational behavior. This is certainly not responsible conduct on part of at least this one particular country. And I would argue, and I'm not a great military analyst or anything by any stretch of imagination, but the several decades of India's own postures of so-called strategic restraint, which is that you come punch us here, you come punch us there, you come and do a 26/11 terrorist attack, and we will constantly play this gay card of strategic restraint as if lives lost don't mean anything to us, lives lost due to terrorism, lives lost due to cross-border incursions don't mean any cost. So I think this political strategy of strategic restraint, which is really another way of saying we don't have the guts to do anything, has really, in a sense, emboldened some countries. And you saw that in Pakistan, you saw that even in the case of China. And the simple rule, law of the jungle, as a commonsensical person, is that if you have to deal with a bully, you have to, at least make sure the bully knows there are consequences for his bullying action, consequences for his action that violate the rules and laws. So I think this India today is an India that has traveled a long journey or a long distance from the India of 1962.
So there will not be any turning of the other cheek? Yes.
I don't think so. I think countries that today look at India and say that we want to inflict damage on India, we want to slow down India's rise as an economic power, we want to create some unrest, whether it's Neville Singham type unrest or any other type of unrest, will have to deal with a very determined 1.2 billion Indians who are today determined under Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji to protect ourselves, not just for the sake of security, not for a debate on security, but also to ensure our economic rise continues, our growth and roadmap to being a developed nation is not thwarted by inimical interests. And therefore, a strong nation is a nation that guarantees its own growth, is something that now is understood, well understood, certainly has been shown by our political leadership, by our Prime Minister, but much more than that, or as equally important is that, as well understood by the people of India, that the only guarantor for our economic growth and success is a strong security posture, the ability to defend ourselves, and the only people who constantly will snipe at the modernization of our armed forces or our position vis-a-vis particular countries are people who have a vested interest in basically keeping India weak, akin to the strategic restraint strategy that we followed for 40 years, 50 years.
So 2611, coming to 2611, you were the only member of parliament at that time who's consistently flagged this issue of Pakistan-sponsored terror. In fact, you moved a private member bill as well to declare Pakistan a terror state.
Yeah.
Do you think that we erred in not pushing the line with the Pakistan military, which seems to have orchestrated the entire
I think
attack?
Sandeep, the world has learned. India learned this many years on. We just unfortunately had a government that didn't do anything with the learning. And then 2014 onwards, we had Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji, who basically said, look, if somebody tries to do something to us, it is absolutely our duty, a government's duty, to protect our people, to do something right back. That the cost of being badly behaved, the costs and consequences of being a poorly behaved nation, an irresponsible army, was never something that was shown to Pakistan. They played this game for several decades of being the favorites of USA in the US-Taliban conflict, then the favorites of US in the US-Soviet Union conflict, the Cold War. So they played that game for a long time, and under that game, under that charade, got away with a lot of absolutely, unconscionable, irresponsible conduct, which is missile proliferation, nuclear proliferation, terror. And as long as it was only India that was complaining about it, the world ignored it. But when the consequences of all that started getting exported to countries in the Middle East, in Europe, in the US, North America, I think the world woke up that there is no, and the famous quote of Hillary Clinton, if you start growing snakes in your backyard, one of those days the snakes will come back and bite you. So I think today our approach to every country in our neighborhood is a very clear approach, that we have no interest in doing anything with you. We want to live coexist in a peaceful manner. Our priority, our government's priority, our people's priority is to grow our nation and take it to where we believe our tryst is, which is economic superpowerdom. We want to be the number 3 economy in the world. And we have no quarrel with anybody. We don't seek anybody's territory. We certainly don't want part of China or part of Pakistan. Even though the people of POK certainly have would prefer to be reunited with India. But countries like Pakistan, countries like other countries who have made it their business inciting, creating, stoking unrest, will find it that this is a very different India today than it ever has been in the history of independent India.
Do you see any parallels with the way India conducted the 1962 war, the response to the 62 war, as compared to how we responded to 2611 or 15 years back?
I think they both. I think they were genetically and DNA wise the same type of government. I mean, I think in 62, Pandit Nehru was maybe deluded into believing that he was so loved by the Chinese that the Chinese would never invade him. And the Chinese broke that delusion very rapidly, very swiftly, with great consequences. In 2611, again, we were deluded into believing that, as long as the Americans were there and as long as some Western countries give us lip service, that the Pakistanis would never launch terror attacks against India. And this publicly spoken, repeated strategy of strategic restraint, which we as our government during the 2611 time frame, that government of UPA kept spouting, only emboldened these elements. Because if you know today, if you're a bully and you know that the other person has publicly agreed to never hit back, then he's going to do what he wants to do. And he is going to do it often, he's going to do it with great consequences to you. So the strategic restraint, which somehow became a doctrine for the Congress government, and a cover for absolutely doing nothing. And a lot of what they did, Sandeep, follows a pattern. When we wanted fighter jets, they would buy VIP helicopters. There was almost like a mismatch between the national security priorities and what people were going around doing under the strategic restraint doctrine. So anyway, I think the long story short is that India today is a very different India. I think Pulwama, Balakot, and we have shown what our capabilities are as a nation, as a people, as armed forces. Our modernization of the armed forces has been rapid, deep, pretty tectonic, and the capabilities of domestic industry to deploy, create these new cutting edge technologies that are very relevant: drones, electronic warfare systems, sensors, the satellite technology that we have today. It means that India is a very different country today, and we are prepared today to safeguard what is ours, and we are prepared to safeguard what we believe is our destiny in the coming 5 to 7 years to be a developed nation. So I think that is the difference between India today and India in 62 and India in certainly 2008.
How would you ask for justice for the victims of 26/11, 15 years from the Pakistan army, which clearly sponsored this?
Look, in a lot of ways, I think the justice for all of those victims of terror that was exported from Pakistan over the years, including but not limited to 26/11, or people from all around the world who have been victims to this Pakistan ideology of exporting violence and against innocent people, should rejoice that today, where Pakistan finds itself as a nation, as a country, they were a country that almost always wanted to be hyphenated with India for several years after independence. And today, forget about being a hyphen. They are not even a postscript or a footnote in the story of India. So I think the best revenge, as I read in a book some time back, sometimes is be more successful than your enemy. And certainly by any stretch of imagination, in the last 9 years, the distance between India, the vision of New India, where we are going to go, and what used to be Pakistan or what is Pakistan is, I think the distance and the gap is known to everybody. Beyond that, what other satisfaction can victims derive from Pakistan? I suspect that there's nothing much that we should ask from Pakistan. They have the most discredited army in the world. And I keep saying that for generals who have lost every war, who have lost half their nation, they certainly have more medals per general than any other general on the planet. So I think the less said about the Pakistani army, the better. If the Pakistani people could get rid of their army and for once in the last 75 years since they've been independent, chart their own course as whatever republic they want to be, they would be better off. But that is advice from us to them. They have to learn how to follow it and find their own future. But I don't think we should waste our time anymore, even spending 2 seconds worrying about what justice we can get from them, because we will never expect justice from them. We can never expect justice from them, and we'll never get any justice from them. But we can certainly be satisfied that they're a cipher in our overall scheme of things. They're a very, very minor footnote.
Minister Chandrasekhar, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandeep.